The proceed.
Well, good morning, Professor Grube, and welcome to the Constitution Committee. We're taking evidence this morning into our inquiry into the appointment and dismissal of permanent secretaries and other senior civil servants. And this morning, Professor Dennis Grube, Professor of Politics and Public Policy at Cambridge University and Research Lead at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy, Cambridge, is giving evidence. Thank you very much for agreeing to come, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. We have lots of questions. Hopefully you've been given some indication of where our thinking is. Are there any opening comments you wish to make, or would you prefer us to go straight into the questions?
Well, if I may, first of all, make the opening comment of thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to spend this time with you, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. And if I may make sort of one overarching observation, it would be about what I think is the changing nature of the modern governance environment and how that is impacting on the work and role of permanent secretaries and how we think about the ways in which they should be appointed or dismissed. I think there is more change afoot than we have necessarily allowed for in the change to our traditions of how we do these things. But I look forward to having that discussion as we go along this morning.
Thank you. Well, you identified what we're seeking to look at and take a view on. And shifts and trends over time in the appointment and dismissal of permanent secretaries, senior civil servants, of course, is an issue that we're interested in. So if I could open with the question, in your view or on your evidence, is there a trend for permanent secretaries and other senior civil servants to leave their posts when there's a change of Prime Minister or Cabinet reshuffle takes place? And has this changed over time in your view or on the evidence you have?
Thank you for a very interesting opening question. I mean, perhaps if I come at it in a slightly roundabout way, if I may, which is what I think the trend that I see is a trend towards frustration and disappointment from both sides of what we might call the traditional public sector bargain. So some of my scholarly colleagues would conceive of the public sector bargain as civil servants trading away their partisan views and to some extent their public face in return for access to the centre of government and to the centre of policy making, and in return for the protective shield of ministerial responsibility and accountability. I think there would be frustration and disappointment about the sense to which some of that is slowly diminishing. From the politician side, the public sector bargain is about we get a permanent civil service that provides institutional memory on how things work. It provides responsive advice and allows the government of the day to implement its policies well. And I think there is frustration on the part of ministers about whether the civil service is fulfilling that function. Which links then to the question, which is what we see, I think, as a result of these frustrations are instances of interesting individual circumstances of leaving or being appointed to a senior civil service post, rather than necessarily yet a systemic change across time. So in terms of interesting individual instances, we can think perhaps about a spectrum from perhaps somebody like Mark Sedwell, who can sort of see what is happening and feel the ground moving and therefore moves on, to somebody like perhaps Jonathan Slater, who feels the ground moving rather more strongly, perhaps, through to somebody like the Tom Scholar situation, where you are no longer just being nudged, but being pushed. Those are individual instances, which is not necessarily the same as saying there is a trend. And even in Australia, which I know has something of an unwanted international reputation as a politically rather rough place to be, including for senior public servants, there is, in terms of the time in office, let's say the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, the equivalent, I guess, of the Cabinet Secretary in our system here, but sort of between 2 and 4 years, is relatively constant over the past 3 decades. What is changing slightly is the desire of the Prime Minister of the day to make a statement choice in choosing their head of the public service, their Secretary of DPMC. So, for example, the previous Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, he appointed to that position somebody who had been his Chief of Staff for a number of years while he was Treasurer. And there was some criticism, some perception that made it too political an appointment. The incoming Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has chosen an academic, Professor Glyn Davis, who also has an established reputation as a public policy person, in order, I think, to make a statement about how they would like the civil service to work or not. So the answer, I think, is trend, perhaps not. Interesting individual instances, certainly, as a result of increased frustration and tension in the relationship.
So I want to come on to the question of Prime Minister and ministerial involvement in dismissing or appointing. But so what you're saying, not hard evidence of a trend, but interesting individual cases could be early indicators of change that's taking place in the way the civil service operates at senior level. Is that a fair summary?
I think so, yes. That sense of political contestation around these appointments as a result of this kind of tension, which is not to say that suddenly we are appointing nothing but partisans to senior civil service or public service roles, either here or in Australia.
Well, Trustee, do you want to develop the point about prime ministerial involvement?
Yes, I mean, I slightly get the impression, and tell me if I'm wrong, that what you quite rightly call the modern government environment requires that we should change the way we look at permanent secretaries, that they need different skills, and that the potential increased politicisation is actually quite a good thing, and that their prime ministerial, senior ministerial involvement in dismissing and recruiting permanent secretaries is probably not a bad thing. Is that a sort of fair reflection of what you're saying, or have I overstated it? Because it's clearly not the traditional way of doing it in the UK. In other words, do you think that the traditional system has broken down by whatever forces exist, and that we are entering a new era?
Fascinating question, which will lead to a discussion here, I think, Lord Strathclyde, if I may. So the sense that I have of the British civil service, of the UK civil service, is that it was built for governing in private, and in the 21st century we are governing in public. So if we go all the way back to Northcote Trevelyan and then through the Haldane report, there is a sense of tradition around how this civil service functions, and it functions based on people who know each other well. So the tradition of senior civil servants having gone to university whether it be Cambridge or Oxford or other places, with a sense of mutual understanding and respect that comes from some long-standing relationship, and that then transitions through to the giving of advice in closed ways, behind closed doors, providing that space for an open discussion between politicians and their civil servants. And then when a policy is ready to be announced, the minister would come out and announce it. I am suggesting that that has given way to a scenario where we are governing in public much more. So civil servants are in danger of becoming politicised in terms of perceptions of their work, not because they are in reality any more political now than they have ever been, but because they are more public than they have been, which allows for perceptions to be formed about whether they are political or not. Now that's a very long-winded way in.
Strathclyde.
Strathclyde, I beg your pardon, Lord Strathclyde. The long-winded way into answering your question, which is that if we are then in this more politicised environment, and in an environment in which there is greater politicised discussion around these appointments, we can go one of two ways. We can either allow greater political buy-in into that appointment process, essentially going down the Washington route, or we can restructure the Westminster model to buttress what we would like to see in terms of less political interference, even in this more public environment that we're in.
And which do you think is more attractive? And do you sense that there has been appointments made or dismissals made because a Prime Minister wants somebody more politically amenable towards their point of view? And how do they tell what that point of view is unless they've also had this long-term relationship?
So what I think the result of the governing in public environment is that ministers and prime ministers not unreasonably form views about the likely political sentiments, perhaps, of some senior civil servants. So, to provide some Australian context of that, when the Abbott government came in 2013, they sacked, as one of his first acts, sacked 3 serving public servants, and Martin Parkinson, the Treasury Secretary, announced he would be leaving within a year as the 4th. Now, it so happens that if you look at the career of the departmental secretaries that were asked to leave, somebody like Andrew Metcalfe, who was in charge of the immigration department, had been publicly in the news having to essentially defend a very controversial policy of the government of the day around the Malaysia solution, as it was called. And there is a sense in which his politicised identity may, and I think, have led to the decision, well, he has to go when we get into government. So there is I think, the danger of the public profile is the perception that then flows from it into decision-making around positions and who should be appointed to them.
I've got 2 or 3 takers on this question now. Baroness Andrews. Sorry, Lord Strathclyde, had you finished?
No.
You finished. Baroness Andrews.
Thank you very much indeed. It's extremely interesting, and in your work you've written about what you talk about governing in public and the influence of the media and the more contentious environment. But there is still a very powerful lack of transparency in the British Civil Service, which means that as and when any advice is made public, it is pretty exceptional. And I'm wondering actually whether the comparison with Australia needs to be mediated a bit, and whether or not the tension that you talk about inside Whitehall is not more a tension because the centre of gravity as to where policy is made has shifted, because there are so many more influences on policy. And maybe, I mean, I'd like your view on that, but maybe one of the things that drives permanent secretaries to seek, as you talk about Mark Sedgwill and Jonathan Slater, it may be actually, I don't know, that what leaves people to leave and do more interesting things where they possibly have a bit more purchase than they expected to have is that the fact that policy making itself actually is more shared, by politicians and special advisors. So this is a slightly complicated question, but.
I mean, I think the premise, the observation inside that question is a very good one. That the rise, shall we put it that way, the rise of the SPAD and the sort of flatter horizontal style of policy networks now, meaning that the civil service no longer is the sole or even the main repository of policy-making expertise, could certainly lead to frustration amongst senior appointees. But inherent, I think, in that tension is a recognition that under traditions of Westminster governance, the expectation of having a seat at the policy-making table is still built into what we expect permanent secretaries to do. And if that is no longer reflected in reality to the same extent, then perhaps that is a sign again of the changing expectations of the role of our senior civil servants. So the point, I think, is well made. I would also observe, I think, that in terms of the numbers of SPADs, the sense of contestation, Australia is much worse than the UK. Canada is much worse than the UK. The last time I looked at the figures, they were both well over 400 SPADs in national government in both instances. So that sense of distance, of an extra group of people who are pushing for a role in policy making that may exclude civil servants to a greater degree than they have in the past, is very much strong in those systems too.
Your evidence is very revealing. It reminds me of when I was a councillor in the 1970s in Edinburgh City, and I raised a radical suggestion. I was accused by the Conservatives of being political. And I said, but you are. And they said, no, we're conservative. We're not political. And you've described a situation where, in what you describe as the old Westminster structure, because they all went to Oxbridge, they knew each other, the civil servants and the ministers. Perhaps they went to the same school as well. Perhaps one was a fag of the other, you never know. Politicisation then seemed to be, because it was Labour that was changing things, but now it's the Conservatives that seem to be worried about politicisation. Is that because they realise they've lost the grip that they used to have?
Know your hair as an academic.
As an academic, what do you think?
Would it be wrong of me to characterise that as a provocative question?
It's a probing question.
I think those who I have met and spoken to from both major parties across multiple countries are concerned about these trends. So I don't think it's necessarily a Labor issue or a Conservative issue so much as an issue about continuity of government and the roles that we expect civil servants to do.
It was you that raised the Oxbridge connection, and I find it very revealing. Now you're rowing back a wee bit now, but you were right. That doesn't exist in Australia and New Zealand, and they don't have that kind of sort of snobbish universities, if you'll excuse me.
They do.
You do have to answer leading questions.
My egalitarian sentiments would lead me to say how right you are. I'm slightly less sure that it is the case in practice that there is not also a hierarchy of universities in Australia and some sense of connection.
What's in New Zealand, anyway?
But the point you raise at the start of your question about if you are fulfilling your role, you are then in danger of becoming accused of acting politically as a civil servant, because if you do your job well now, you will have a sufficient public face related to that job that it will allow perceptions to emerge, whether that be from opposition parties, members of the public, who may point the finger at you and say, you are doing your job politically. If your job description is to serve the government of the day loyally to your best ability, and you do that, and as a result, you are then accused of having politicised yourself, I think that indicates the difficulty we are in with a more publicly shaping environment.
Thank you.
Okay, Lord Faulkner.
I'm surprised by your evidence. There seem to me to be two trends that you're identifying. First of all, ministers and prime ministers in the UK have always favoured people they've known from within the civil service to be the cabinet secretary. Robert Armstrong becomes the cabinet secretary. Robin Butler, both of whom are private secretaries to the prime minister, become the cabinet secretary. And it's not surprising that you go for somebody that you've seen in action and you think is good. The change seems to me to be post-2010, the government starts sacking cabinet secretaries and private secretaries, which is a massive, not private secretaries, permanent secretaries. That is the big change. Tom Scholar, Mark Sedwell, Jonathan Slater, the Home Secretary's permanent secretary effectively gets pushed out saying it's been bullied. Surely that represents a change in the trend from the previous trend, where maybe you appointed your ex-private secretary as the cabinet secretary when you were the prime minister, but that's very different from what look like much more proactive dismissals.
I mean, I took the trend question to refer to the length of time in service. There is an interesting discussion, I fully agree, to be had around the nature of the role connecting to the nature of the dismissal and how that then occurs.
My question is focused on, is there a change?
If you take the trend line in relation to dismissal, what would be the answer? And you see a difference in the handling of... We are coming on to the detail of recruitment and redeployment, but in terms of the evidence you see, change around recruitment.
I would broadly agree with the characterisation that the form of interest that is taken in the performance of civil servants leading to a more robust form of dismissal. I would think that is in evidence over the past decade in this country and has been in evidence longer in Australia. The incoming Howard government, 1996, sacked 6 departmental heads as the sort of first act of government. The Night of the Long Knives, it was characterised as. That was a sort of a third of the total. And, you know, the Night of the Slightly Shorter Knives in 2013 represents sort of a similar trend towards using these positions as a way of making a statement about how you wish to stamp your authority upon the public service or the civil service, and who you then put in place as a sign of how you would hope the civil service under your tenure will then act.
Lord Anderson, you had a supplement.
Thank you. Really building on that, I wonder if we could lengthen the historical perspective a bit when we're looking at whether or not there is a trend. You mentioned Northcote Trevelyan. I would love to know what was happening in the late 19th century when new prime ministers came in. Did they replace the head of the civil service? Did they replace important civil service jobs? And what about the 20th century? I was reading recently about Sir Horace Wilson, who was Neville Chamberlain's head of the Home Civil Service. I think Clement Attlee said that he had a hand in everything, he ran everything. I think on Churchill's first or second day in Number 10, he was threatened, perhaps not altogether seriously, with the governorship of Greenland if he was ever seen in Number 10 again. And that was the end of him until he popped up again as Permanent Secretary to the Treasury 3 years later. Is that a blip? Is that something unusual? Or if you were a student of Gladstone and a student of the 20th century prime ministers, would this in fact be quite a normal way of going about it?
Was that? Bob Wilson.
I mean, an excellent... an excellent reminder of the timeline that we are dealing with, and the reason I reach back to Northcote Trevelyan, I suppose, is that it is seen as such a foundation document for the modern civil service and how it runs, and I think it underpins a particular style of operation which makes blips of the kind that you're discussing rare events historically. I would, of course, defer to historians of the period, but my perception is that the terms were considerably longer, and the expectation of a change upon a change in government was really not a part of the conversation. That I think you could trace that back as a much more sort of modern phenomenon, which under my argument connects to the more public profile of civil servants being asked to perform roles in more public ways. So, for example, Lord Wilson, Richard Wilson, when he was standing down as Cabinet Secretary in 2002, gave a speech in which he, already at that point, 20 years ago, pointed to the sense in which civil servants risk becoming more public figures through things like appearances in front of select committees, which is, of course, essentially a 1980s onwards type innovation, through greater media exposure that flows alongside appearances in front of select committees, and the kind of expectation that there's this wonderful phrase that the late Canadian academic Peter O'Coin uses in his argument that Westminster public services are asked to become promiscuously partisan, so that they support the government of the day so strongly as though they were essentially partisan, the only difference being that you then offer exactly the same level of support to the next government that comes in. And he meant that as a critique because he saw a role for the public service in Canada and the civil service here as doing something more than simply backing the government of the day to the hilt. But one of the ways that they are expected to do that is because civil servants speak more, they are then expected to support the government when and wherever they are speaking. and he saw that as a way of diminishing the distance that normally exists between the government of the day and the constitutionally based civil service.
Can I just ask one last question? I mean, you referred to the wider shift of governing in private to governing in public, and the civil service having to adapt by that, either by default or by plan, one way or another. And I think you said the two options were sort of, I'm summarising your words, but you either adjust, a country either adjusts to greater political buy-in in terms of civil service appointments, but adapt to that openly, or buttress the Westminster system as a means of adapting. But either route, is it inevitable that impartiality and quality of advice in terms of truth to power will be compromised? Or is there a solution? Well, obviously that's a very difficult question. Do you feel it's inevitable, whatever solution is taken, that impartiality and quality of advice, truth to power, will be compromised or weakened?
I mean, it's a grave question. It's a question that I think a lot about, and I'm still developing answers to. I think if I'm right about the trend within the modern governance environment, then I am suggesting that it is changing whether we like it or not. So that the change is real. And in a sense, we are dealing with that change by tinkering at the edges to try and maintain these underlying traditions of all the way back to Northcote Trevelyan, the idea of impartiality, the idea of the merit principle, all of which I think are embedded in the DNA of the civil service and frankly should be there. So if our goal is to protect that extent, that degree of impartiality, can we somehow invest the system with a greater degree of bipartisan trust to allow for the impartiality to continue whilst serving the government of the day in what is a very difficult, hyper-partisan, sometimes governing environment? So the examples that spring to my mind are the Federal Chancellor in Switzerland, who is essentially the chief bureaucrat, if you like, is voted in by a vote of Parliament. It's done by secret ballot. Others are unable to stand against him, and that is done every 4 years. The Public Service Commissioner in Canada is largely selected by the Prime Minister as a governing council appointment, but in order to take that position up, has to have a resolution of the House of Commons and the Canadian Senate in support of the holder of that position. So it's not entirely radical to think about ways in which we can protect the non-partisan integrity of those positions, potentially through the use of Parliament as one mechanism to avoid this sense of loss of trust in the midst of political battle of a partisan kind.
Thank you. That's interesting. We're going to come back again to the question of the future role of civil servants, but let's, for the moment, drill down more into the processes of recruitment, redeployment, dismissal of senior civil servants. Lord Anderson, I think you had an opening question on this. Thank you.
Yes, it is a process question, I'm afraid. You've spoken to us to some extent about the practice in other countries, particularly Australia. You've told us about the difference in numbers of SPADs and so on. But if you're actually looking at the standard process for recruitment, redeployment and dismissal of senior civil servants which we know from our Civil Service Commission recruitment principles in particular. How different is that process in other countries that share the Westminster system of government?
I think I would characterise the answer as not nearly as different as one might expect across a diverse range of countries. So the extent to which Prime Ministers and Ministers are interested in the appointment of their most senior officials, I think, is a constant across our sort of family, if you like, of Westminster countries. I think that is nothing new. Prime Ministers and Ministers have always been interested, and when that has been running alongside a shared view of the need to maintain the impartiality of the civil service, to select particular kinds of civil servants, that has worked, reasonably well. So the answer to the process question is that in Canada, it's they are governor in council appointments, which is essentially prime ministerial appointments of deputy ministers. The Prime Minister will discuss those selections with the clerk of the Privy Council and with the President of the Public Service Commission in Canada, but it is essentially a prime ministerial appointment. In Australia, again, that same sort of group of players, if you like, are present. So the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet is consulted, the Public Service Commission head is consulted, and will provide a report to the Prime Minister on any candidates that are brought forward, but it is in the Prime Minister's gift to then make that decision. The potentially interesting difference, I think, is in dismissal, which is that the New Zealand system, the head of the Public Service Commission in New Zealand has a greater role in dismissal than in other countries. So if a minister or the Prime Minister feels that a departmental head or a chief executive, as they're called in the New Zealand system, is not performing and in fact has done something wrong and should be dismissed, they will write to the head of the Public Sector Commission and say, can you please investigate whether this person should be dismissed? And it is then the head of the Public Sector Commission who will make that decision, which feels somewhat different to the prime ministerial gift being withdrawn, as it were, in the UK or in Australia.
Of course, one distinctive feature of our process as set out in the recruitment principles is the existence of a selection panel on which the Prime Minister, or the Minister as the case may be, doesn't sit, whose job it is to produce a list of appointable candidates from which the Minister can choose. And my understanding is that, certainly according to the latest version of the principles, the Minister is entitled to meet the shortlisted candidates, ask them questions, but is excluded from the deliberations of the panel itself. Is there anything equivalent to that in the countries that you've mentioned?
Again, I would characterise that as relatively normal for the other countries, Australia, Canada. So there is, and New Zealand, an expectation or an understanding that ministers will be consulted, that ministers may have the option to shape the position description, to give advice to the panel, but will then step aside, as it were, to allow the panel to actually make the decision that is made.
Is there an independent element on the panel, or is it who sits on these panels?
They, depending on the country, the Public Sector Commission looms large and sits on these panels, and the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet also. So to the extent that the Public Service Commission remains a or has some strength as an independent body, then they are the providers of the independence, if you like.
You mentioned dismissals, but concentrating on recruitment, do you see any features of any of the processes in any other Westminster-style countries that you think we could learn from with advantage in the UK?
I mean, it's one of the challenges, isn't it, across our systems, that we are looking for talent well beyond civil service to try and draw in other actors, and yet the reality again and again is that the vast majority of these appointments are of, in the end, experienced civil servants and experienced public servants. And that is the result that the process as it stands gives us, but I think it is also a reflection of what ministers want and value in terms of the need to have people who actually understand how the public service runs.
Okay, thank you. Baroness Andrews.
Can I just pursue the dismissal aspects of this? You talked about a night of the long nights, 1996. What was the government that actually came in at that point? And if in fact they succeeded in getting rid of a third of their permanent secretaries, was there any explicit public process, or was it simply a political decision in each of those cases? Was that decision taken by the Prime Minister or by departmental ministers? Was there any political fallout? Did anybody come to the aid of, I think the permanent secretary trade union is pretty powerful, but did anyone publicly say the Westminster system is no longer valid, we are breaking all the rules here of proper process, this should not have been done? What was the political and the professional fallout? So there's quite a series of questions there.
So there were undoubtedly or definitely critiques from some of my academic colleagues who are great upholders of the Westminster system, and there was some criticism in the media, but we also have to understand the context, I think. So this was after a long period of government. So the previous government had been in office from 1983 to 1996.
This was the Labour government.
It was the Labour government. The incoming Prime Minister, John Howard, after that length of time in the previous government, undoubtedly politically wanted to place his stamp, and this was the way, one way in which he chose to stamp his authority, if you like, and he selected a very strong head of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Maxwell Wilton, to take up that position, and his sort of persona was again seen as a sense of John Howard's political authority coming in. So it is a statement that is made. The Westminster system, in my reading of it, doesn't actually have a problem with that to the extent that we are reliant upon traditions and conventions of action. The tradition and convention of action would suggest it is rare and not necessarily, in my view, desirable for an incoming government to sack 6 heads, departmental heads. But if we are relying on a system built on tradition and convention, it is only as strong as people's desire to uphold that convention. And if circumstances allow and the political will is there, we can do many, there are many options open to a Prime Minister. And I think we are seeing, or have seen in recent times in the UK, elements of the same operation. So, the removal of Tom Scholar, for example, is a statement moment by the political leaders of the day, it is not the norm, but because we rely on convention and tradition, it is merely a bucking of convention and tradition rather than something more.
Yes, I think I accept that by and large. In the case of Tom Scholar, the nature of the advice was a big issue that he was likely to be providing. When you get rid of 6 permanent secretaries, a Prime Minister who deliberately sets out to be totally different from previous Prime Minister, and then puts his people in place to represent that difference. I think when we were discussing previously last week, the absence of any proper process around dismissal, it seems to me that this was pretty large in Australia at that time, and nobody challenged the absence of that process or what it might do to the character and the leadership of the civil service as a whole.
Yeah, I accept that point in the sense that the voices raised against it were not as strong or as with a sufficient sense of outrage to suggest to a future Prime Minister that this was not a course of action that should be pursued or pursuable. And I think my general point around the convention and tradition sense is a lot of our system of government works because we have the conventions and traditions. The flexibility, some sense of ambiguity is helpful. Around the appointment and dismissal of permanent secretaries, perhaps it is not so helpful. And, it would be, in terms of HR processes, quite rare, I would think, in any other place to have that kind of approach be acceptable the way it is.
We've been in an industrial tribunal quite quickly.
Rod Fuchs, you had a question.
You mentioned the Public Service or Public Sector Commission in Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Are they similar in composition to our civil service commissioners?
Yes.
And they have the same powers, roughly?
Roughly, yes.
And how are they appointed?
So that varies slightly. The head of the Public Service Commission in New Zealand is essentially still a prime ministerial appointment. But as I was alluding to with Canada, there is now this requirement that a resolution of both the Senate and the House of Commons supports the appointment. In Australia, it is again in the gift of the Prime Minister on who may take advice from the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet.
So is the person appointed seem to be independent if he's appointed, he or she is appointed by the Prime Minister in that way?
It's a very good question, because there is something here about the culture of government in different countries as well. And so in New Zealand, my sense is that they are seen as more independent because the Public Service Act of 2020 sort of vests quite significant power in that position in a way that indicates they have some independent judgments to make. And in Canada, I think the appointment is for 7 years, again quite deliberately to indicate that this is not about one particular party in power for a particular period of time, but a more independent service.
Have there been any controversies about any of the appointments, as we've had here?
Academics, we find controversy everywhere, but I think there is an instance of, in the last 5 or 6 years, of an appointment of the Public Service Commissioner in Australia, where he was seen as a potentially slightly politicised appointment. I have to remind myself of the exact circumstances of that. but I would not. It was not a controversy in the sense of it was on everybody's lips in every coffee shop in.
And here they're very powerful. The civil service commissioners can decide whether or not to have open competition. That's a very powerful, influential decision, isn't it?
I mean, it is, and it's interesting that in the Australian version of the merit principle, open competition is written into what is required of merit. So we know a merit appointment is a merit appointment if there is open competition as part of it. So it's clearly an important choice.
Okay, thank you. If we could come back to this issue of civil service leaders becoming more publicly prominent and the implications there on recruitment and dismissal. Lord Faulkner, you had a question.
Yes, you've described, Professor Grube, that civil servants, senior civil servants, are becoming more public. You referred to select committees and you referred to them giving media interviews. What effect do you think that's had, first of all, on the dismissal of public servants, and secondly on the recruitment? And I have in mind particularly the most recent prominent dismissals of public servants in the UK, Stedwell, Slater and Scholar.
I think this is a really interesting area. The sense in which if you yourself become a public figure, and by public figure we're not necessarily thinking of celebrity civil servants of Beyonce range of publicity, but sufficiently public that you will have statements on the public record. You will have had to support quite difficult policy situations, and a Prime Minister, the ministers who might be in the Prime Minister's ear, will have a view from those things around whether, A, you might be difficult to work with.
It's a different issue. I'm talking about the publicity element. What effect has that had on their dismissals and on subsequent recruitment?
So, I guess I'm building my argument to the sense that because you've been public or have become more public, the opportunity for a perception of you emerges from that, which can then play through to a decision to dismiss you, or a decision to start to publicly cede the ground, as it were, for your dismissal or for a shift and a change. Those things are possible because of the more public profile.
So could you make a connection between that answer and any one of the three dismissals I've referred to?
The extent to which education was a particularly difficult issue during the pandemic, as we all know, and the extent to which that became a hot topic of public conversation, with many strong views around the performance or not of Ofqual, of the permanent secretary, Jonathan Slater, of the Secretary of State, Gavin Williamson. And as a result of that public controversy and that public contestation, the view was formed that somebody needed to take responsibility for that. And, without knowing intimately the details of the individuals concerned, I would be surprised if that did not play into the decision around the dismissal of...
I don't see what that's got to do with whether or not Jonathan Slater, for example, was a more public figure. I mean, from my own looking at it as an observer, I didn't think Jonathan Slater was a public figure in any shape or form. So I'm not quite sure what connection you're saying his dismissal has to the fact that that public servants generally are more public figures?
So, I mean, if I can go back to Lord Wilson's 2002 speech and the sense in which the changing nature of public political contestation exposes public servants to public political contestation in ways that they were previously not exposed. So that is not the same as saying necessarily that Jonathan Slater was on the front page of every newspaper as we must dismiss this man. But because of the strongly political nature of the arguments that were being had, it places greater pressure on the government of the day to be seen to be taking action, which leads potentially his dismissal.
They're becoming more public figures. It's a means of demonstrating action.
Well, I mean, I would make the argument that the two are connected.
How? Explain.
So, I mean, if we think back 20 or 30 years, we didn't even know, myself as a member of the public, let's say, who the head of our security agencies was, of MI5 or MI6. We fast forward to the current day, and those officers are not only well known, but they give public speeches about the nature of the security environment in which we find ourselves. And that is, I think, demonstrably a more public profile that is being built, that when things go wrong, if things do go wrong, will connect through to perceptions of whether those people should be in post or not. So again, it is a different form, I think, of celebrity to I'm on the front page of the paper every day, but in relative terms, I remember a great phrase of Lord Hennessy's speaking of permanent secretaries as barely household names in their own household. I think we have moved on from that era, and that then contributes to the circumstances that they find themselves in.
Do you think that this greater, well, you're not saying I think the senior civil servants have a greater, well, you are saying they've got a greater public profile. Do you think that should change the way that they're appointed and recruited, appointed and dismissed? Or do you think if it does change the way that they're appointed or dismissed, because this exchange suggests to me that they're not appointed or dismissed on the basis of the greater publicity, because it's just but it's a means of demonstrating something by the minister. Do you think that should give the minister a greater choice in senior dismissals or appointments?
I mean, my personal view, it goes back, I think, to this sense that if I'm right, if change is happening, we have the choice of either embracing the change, moving towards a more politicised mode of appointment and dismissal, or turning to different ways to buttress our existing Westminster traditions. So I am not in favour of greater control of appointment and dismissal by ministers as a result of the trends that are happening. All I'm trying to draw attention to is the sense that because there is change in our governing environment, that will change the matrix of decision making around those appointments.
But it should be resisted.
Well, I think we need to make a definitive choice, because otherwise it will happen by stealth. So I think this is
no sensible objective observer would say, let's allow ministers to sack senior civil servants in order to demonstrate a political point, would you? That wouldn't be sensible as policy, would it?
I take that as a slightly leading question.
It's intended to be a leading question, but you can say no to it.
No, because we have seen it as a matter of practice on several occasions in Australia. I think it is within the boundaries of the current Westminster tradition, but it is not desirable.
Staying with Lord Faulkner's point, because there's two issues here, aren't there? There's the shift of government from private to the public arena more, and it's also, our civil servants appearing more publicly. And just, if there's a greater shift, are you saying if there's a greater shift to governing in public rather than governing in private, then making civil service head's role becomes a public political statement by government? You make a political statement through sacking a senior civil servant. Allegedly, you don't want Treasury orthodoxy, so you make a political statement by... is that what you're saying also happens? I'm not...
I think yes. That is, if we're sort of jotting down before the different sort of reasons why might we sack, why might we wish to move a permanent secretary. We might want to do it to put in our own people, our own partisans. I think there is little evidence of that. That we sack in order to put in place somebody who is demonstrably of either party. We sack to make a statement about who's the boss, the John Howard approach in Australia, and I think there are elements of that in the approach that we saw with the removal of Tom Scholar. We might remove people because we aren't sure they have the right skill set. I think, on the whole, there is little evidence of that, although we could have, I'm sure, a debate around whether the idea that Treasury orthodoxy is so baked into somebody that they are not capable then of thinking of policy from a different perspective, which I doubt. Or we can choose someone that we work with better because we have history with somebody, or we feel that our personalities don't gel, and so we require a different person to work with. I think to the extent that we see changes, we see them on that sort of basis of sort of personalisation, and this trend, if we can call it that, let's not call it a trend, let's call it interesting instances of removing people as a political statement of intent.
In the UK, the new trend that you are identifying, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is the trend to dismiss the senior civil servant to make a political point. That's new.
And let me walk back the trend and refer to it as interesting instances. But I think those interesting instances are new, yes.
Thank you. Staying with the principles of ministerial involvement in dismissals or redeployment, Lord Hope, you had a...
Yes, I think you said that you're not in favour of greater ministerial involvement in dismissals or redeployments. But that raises a question, if you go back to your phrase of relying on tradition and convention. Is it enough now for us to rely on tradition or convention, or do we need to develop principles like the recruitment principles, which are designed to deal with the problems of dismissal and redeployment? Because without clarity, there is a risk, isn't there, of a continuing drift to greater involvement, which I think you disapprove of.
Mm-hmm. I think the short answer is yes. So let me give a slightly longer answer so it makes clear what I'm saying yes to, which is that the time is ripe, I think, for a greater formalisation around these processes of both appointment and dismissal in particular, because the convention has been shown to only be as strong as the desire of a government to uphold the convention, and there are dangers in that, in particular the way the dismissal function is now carried out.
Yeah. Well, let's assume that you're right about that. Where do we go to achieve this statement of principles? Is it back to the Commission? Are they the proper people to set to work and define the principles and make them public? Or is there somebody else we should look to?
To the extent that other countries give us models to follow, and the most recent model I think is the New Zealand one, which is why it's in my mind, they have made the decision to vest greater power and responsibility in the Public Sector Commission as the place that looks after the hiring and firing of senior civil servants, essentially, and the processes involved in them, because they are able to generate a sense of independence, or a perception of independence, which I think is so important if we are to overcome the politicised contexts around which these events happen.
Is there a difference between dismissal and redeployment? Because you think of the effect on the individual of dismissal, it can be very severe. Redeployment, one would have thought, would be less so because there's a continuation of employment within the civil service. Does that suggest that greater emphasis on the need for principles should be directed to dismissal? Or should they be treated the same?
I mean, I conceptually very much agree with you. There is an enormous distinction between redeployment and dismissal, and so they should not be treated the same, but I think it is useful to have genuine clarity around how that is done and the circumstances in which it is done, so that we are not simply redeploying people only in lieu of otherwise sacking them, but there are clear guidelines around how that needs to work.
Yes. Two questions, perhaps moving slightly away from my particular point. Do we have anything to learn from the reported recruitment of Sue Gray as Chief of Staff for the Leader of the Opposition? I mean, how far that's gone for the moment is not widely known, and I'm not really concerned with the detail of her position, but do we have anything learned from the reported change in her position about the impartiality of civil servants? And do we also have something to learn about publicity? Because I'm not sure it's within the ethic of the civil service for senior civil servants to promote themselves publicly. But there are ways in which it just happens. I mean, you're called before a select committee, you have to make a speech, or you're invited to do something, the press get onto it, and so on. I mean, is this something of the trend that you're talking about, that there are risks that senior servants run into, that whether or not they like it, they're being promoted into a public arena which is contrary to the ethic which they began with when they entered the service?
I very much like that characterisation, and it reminds me of Lord Wilson's phrase that the civil service has a gene against this, this reluctance to be drawn into the public domain, and yet the nature of Sue Gray's work in particular placed her in the public domain, whether she liked it or chose it or not. I mean, I think our dilemma here in some ways is not a new one, which is that we want to attract the very best, most interesting, intelligent, brightest people to work in government, to work as politicians, to work as senior civil servants, and the problem is if they are good at their job, they will make all sorts of connections and networks whilst they're doing it, and that is why having a process as we do with the committee looking at business appointments, etc., that allows some time between what you have, how you have served, be it in politics or in the civil service, and what you do next is important. But I think the test on Sue Gray is there any indication that she was anything other than a frank and fearless, non-partisan civil servant whilst she was carrying out that role. I don't see evidence that she was anything other than a frank and fearless, non-partisan civil servant whilst carrying out that role. Should we therefore ring-fence civil servants from ever doing anything else? I think that is too harsh a bar, but propriety by itself is not sufficient. We must have the perception of propriety, which is why the committee that advises government on this needs to have the teeth to really indicate we need a period of 1 year or whatever the period is to allow for any perceptions of impropriety in the appointment to pass.
Her position is interesting. Of course, she went into the public domain. She was asked to carry out this inquiry as to what happened in Downing Street. So there's an element of accident is in the way in which senior civil servants, like it or not, are promoted into the public arena. And should that worry us when you go back to your point earlier about the choice of a minister, or the minister's preference for somebody who's become well known for various reasons? Does that worry you compared with decisions based solely on merit?
Does it worry me? I think it does concern me, and my concern is based on the sense that if you are drawn into the public arena simply by doing your job, so if you are doing your job well, you are serving the government of the day, you are carrying out an independent inquiry for the government of the day, and as a result of that, expose yourself to certain perceptions about whether you are politicised or not, that is difficult because we are placing civil servants in a position where we are either saying, don't do your job so well that you become a household name, or do it that way and run the risk. And, we could think back even to the Plebgate inquiry and Jeremy Hayward having to run that, this sense of difficult things land on the desks of senior civil servants, and we ask them to deal with these difficult things as part of their job, and as a result, they may face perceptions of politicisation.
Thank you.
Well, Strathclyde, I know you're interested in this point. Do you want to follow through?
Yeah, I don't think I've got anything to add to the Sue Gray question, which I think you've covered very well. But just sort of going back to some of the things that you've said, you pointed out that there have been interesting instances when certain things have happened. But does that offend entirely against the principles of having conventions and traditions? And I sort of got from what you said that actually the system of conventions and traditions works pretty well generally, albeit there has been a change over the last 30 years of civil servants having to go to select committees and now the challenge of social media and so on. But where they're asked more process questions rather than policy questions, and they have to defend the process but not necessarily the policy, which naturally is up to the political system.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's a really interesting point to think about the conventions and the role that they play in our governance. I completely agree with that. If we take ministerial accountability, ministerial responsibility, the idea that if something goes wrong in your department, you should take responsibility and resign is an embedded convention of Westminster governance. It almost never happens. Ministers generally will resign as a result of personal missteps that are not necessarily related to policy. The policy response now is often, I'll look into it and I'll fix it. Which we need the flexibility of convention around that. I'm not as convinced that we need the same extent of flexibility around the appointment and dismissal of permanent secretaries. So there are places where greater flexibility is really helpful to us. There are places where it allows for, how can we characterise it? Moving away from convention in ways that make political statements that are not necessarily helpful in hiring and firing sort of matters.
No. I beg my list, but not. Sorry. Had you finished, Lord Strathclyde?
Yes, I mean, I think you've covered them. I mean, there is a tension between the two. That's what you're saying, and I suppose we're looking at how that tension works in practice.
Lord Anderson, then I'll come back.
My question comes directly after Lord Strathclyde, and it's really just a question of clarification. You answered Lord Hope that yes, you thought there should be some principles in place governing ministerial involvement in dismissals and redeployment. You mentioned the New Zealand model, and you spoke about guidelines. Can I just be clear what you think those guidelines should deal with? Should they simply deal with the process for dismissal and redeployment, or should they venture to enter into the territory of criteria for dismissal or redeployment?
It's a fascinating question. The role of a permanent secretary is so unique. The range of business that may come across their desk is so, again, I suppose, unique, that setting up specific criteria for dismissal leaves open the possibility that we will set the criteria wrong, or that we will not cover every potential circumstance, in which case having some clarity can lead to unintended consequences. That said, the New Zealand wording, I believe, is for just cause, so I'd have to do further research into whether they have explained in greater depth what just cause means for the Public Service Commissioner to move towards dismissing a chief executive in the New Zealand system. So I think greater clarity without necessarily a list of 10 things for which you can be sacked, quite as specifically as I envision a criteria set.
Very briefly, it's more of a reflection than a question. I've been slightly concerned that with this, it's not confusion, the idea that the Select Committee is somehow actually an untoward exposure of civil servants. It's part of a process of opening up government over the past 30 years, making it available to interrogation, explanation and greater transparency. And it's a perfectly routine appearance by a civil service, which we would want to absolutely anticipate. There is a difference there between that and the provocative article or appearance, which I think is very rare and which raises a lot of other issues. And there is also something to be considered, I think, between the role of the public expert, who is also a civil servant, as we saw over the pandemic, and the implications and the sensitive position that they get into, actually, when they are seen to be advising government and that advice is not taken. I think there is subtlety around here that we must take into account when we're making some of these judgments about what is appropriate, what is likely to happen, and the perception that that will have on the business of government and the role of the civil servant. So I just wanted to reinforce actually what Lord Strathclyde was saying about the difference between process and politics. Really.
And I mean, thank you. And what I'm reminded of, I suppose, is in constitutional terms, the indivisibility of executive government, of ministers and civil servants, going all the way back to Haldane, if not earlier. And the slight tension that is then built in to civil servants giving evidence to select committees, for example. So in one model, you are accountable to Parliament, in the sense that as an accounting officer you come to Parliament, Parliament is fully entitled to ask you questions, as opposed to I am an indivisible part of executive government, and under notions of ministerial responsibility, it is not for me to answer questions but for the minister. And so is there a tension there, I guess?
We could have a very interesting discussion on the holding principle and whether that still holds, actually, I think. Yeah.
We just, before we move on, just go back to Lord Strathclyde's question, where he was basically, my summary of his words, he'll correct me if I'm wrong, do interesting incidents necessarily undermine conventions and practices when looked across over time? And your reply was, well, it's the extent of the flexibility and moving away from those conventions and practices, which I presume can be either in volume or type. Just to put some flesh on that, would you like to, if you don't, that's fine, but would you like to suggest UK examples which, in your view, indicated the risk of flexibility exercise was too great in terms of undermining the conventions and practices, so we can get a sort of qualitative feel of what you're saying there?
So if I understand your question correctly, the sense to which the dismissal of somebody like Tom Scholar is against convention.
Some instant, yeah.
I think the extent to which that was against convention is highlighted in the reaction that came to it. The shock, I think, was an indication of the strength of that convention, and therefore the surprise at its breach, including, I think, the manner of its breach and the way it was essentially foreshadowed as an instance where we would simply not be following the convention on this occasion.
I was going to say, and any other? I mean, we're all kind of rather focused on Tom Scholar. It's a big issue, but do you have any other instances which you would nominate as indicating moving away too far or too much flexibility?
In the UK, I see less of those instances than I do in other countries, in particular in Australia and Canada. And I think the tensions are the same, but up until this point, the strength of the convention has been greater in its demonstration here, so that the idea that you would come in and as a political statement move or dismiss your senior civil servant is noteworthy.
Okay. Did you want to, I just wanted to do justice to your question, but you don't want to supplement?
No, I don't think there's anything else. So.
No. Okay. If we can, I haven't missed anyone, have I? No. Sorry, I was busy on my own question. Right, if we could move to recruitment, redeployment and dismissal processes. Lord Faulkner, you had a...
Yes. You've given interesting instances of occasions where I think it might be said the conventions have been broken and it's led to more politicisation or, I think, personalisation, you're also saying, in relation to the recruitment, redeployment and dismissal processes around senior civil servants. What effect do you think that has on the role of a permanent secretary as an accounting officer? I.e., a senior civil servant who's got to say, I am not going to agree to the expenditure of public money unless you give me a specific direction.
In many ways, I think the shift towards what I would characterise as a more hyper-partisan environment right now that we have seen, let's say, over the past half a dozen years, and not just in the UK, places the accounting officer side of a permanent secretary's role in difficult waters. So on one side, you are finding yourself engaged ever more in ever more political battles in your permanent secretary role, with the requirement to offer frank and fearless advice and push back as required, and then in your public, your accounting officer role, you have to essentially defend your management of the department in a way that does not bleed into the hyper-partisan politics that you are also wrestling with on the other side, the other aspect. And it speaks to this, I think, inherent tension that we were just discussing about whether your accountability to Parliament is a tension against your indivisible partnership with the executive government of the day.
You said just then, interestingly enough, that you referred to the, quote, hyper-partisan atmosphere in the last half dozen years, not just in the United Kingdom. Do you regard the hyper-partisan atmosphere in the last half dozen years in the United Kingdom as being a contributor to, for example, the dismissal of Tom Scholar, Jonathan Slater and Mark Sedwell?
I think it is incredibly difficult to remove events from the context in which they occur. So would those movements and dismissals have occurred in exactly the same way under previous administrations and previous times? I don't think they would.
Well, would they have occurred at all? What's the comparables before that 6-year period?
I think.
What do you think the comparable to, for example, the removal of Sedwell as the Cabinet Secretary? What's the comparable to the removal of Tom Scholar as the Treasury Permanent Secretary you have in mind? Maybe not precisely the same circumstances, obviously, but something that you would regard as similar. This is in the UK background.
Yeah. I mean, in the UK setting, I struggle to point to a comparable circumstance of what we have seen in that sort of past half a dozen year period. As the discussion we were just having around whether the convention has held stronger, longer here than I think it has in other countries. So
does that mean, because you accepted that Tom Scholar looks like a breach of the convention, you used the word breach, are you saying before Tom Scholar and maybe Sedwell and Slater there hadn't been breaches like that? Or if you could point to the breaches previously, I'd be interested.
Yeah, I mean, I genuinely, an immediate breach, if we stick with that term, of that nature does not spring to mind.
And do you accept that, and I mean, I'm putting the question too pressuringly, do you think that the Sedwell and the Slater removals look like breaches?
I mean, I don't want to get hung up, as it were, on the word breaches as opposed to unusual instances.
Okay. Do you regard Scholar as a breach or an unusual instance?
That is...
Silly question.
No, it's a fine line, I was going to suggest. A fine line, and I'm not sure I'm entirely comfortable with one side or the other, except to say it was a particularly interesting and rare instance.
Thanks.
Third alternative.
What?
Third alternative.
Thanks. Just staying with this point as permanent secretaries, as accounting officers, because we discuss and consider at great length how civil servants should serve the government and ministers, whether describe and explain or actively defending government policy. And I don't particularly want to go there. But of course, the principal accountant role brings in a serving public interest because it's actually a constitutional check on ministerial actions, and it alerts the public to lack of propriety, high standards of public conduct. And I noticed in one of your own pieces, you refer to the evidence from Lord Macpherson before a House of Commons committee as to why his advice regarding currency during the Scottish independence referendum, where he says he agreed to that being published because he had a duty to serve the national interest, which suggests that that the role, well, more than suggests, but the role of civil servants isn't only to serve a government and ministers, but there is a duty to the public interest and accountability to Parliament. What do you say about trends in the shift to public government, defending the integrity of that second role of defending the public interest, and a willingness to ask for ministerial direction? We have had evidence from others last week saying, well, there should be more instances of Perm secretaries asking for ministerial directions, and there might be a chilling effect on them exercising that public interest function that they have. What do you say about that?
Another very interesting question. So the national interest component, citing it or relying upon it to support your actions gives rise to the question of who determines what is in the national interest in any given circumstance. So we can either adopt the sort of model that New Zealand has adopted, which is that briefing papers that go to Cabinet are publicly released once the decision has been made, or we hold to a tighter tradition of not revealing advice to ministers. The spectrum in between is ill-defined and, again, is an area of convention, essentially, where it is unusual to do, as Lord Macpherson himself noted, it is not an action that he takes regularly or often. It was the unusual circumstance of the Scottish referendum that led him to view this as a moment where the public interest or the national interest required him to release this piece of information. The fact that it was sort of supportive of the position of the government of the day is interesting in the sense that would we expect permanent secretaries to release a view if it was against the view of the government of the day on the grounds that it's in the national interest to do so? And could we allow that kind of action without some kind of political firestorm resulting from it. So I think there is a tension there, and the beauty of the ministerial direction is that it is a resolution to that tension, because it gets us away from, I have personally assessed what is in the national interest in this case, towards democratic accountability from a minister saying, I will take responsibility for the decision in this case.
And do you think that the Permanent Secretary role as accounting officer, willingness to use that procedure, is impacted by public government?
I mean, to some extent, and I have to look at the figures on this, but I'm surprised that it is not perhaps a more common occurrence than it is, because it is a structural, allowable response from a permanent secretary in a difficult governing environment to rely upon that. I think the traditions of civil service work, understandably and appropriately, are to try and find ways to work with ministers and with the government of the day, and to navigate disagreements or provide advice in ways that don't end up with a ministerial direction at the end. That tradition, I think, is quite strongly embedded still in civil servants, which may be diminishing the number of times that they are willing to go what is in a sense the end of the spectrum, which is to seek a ministerial direction rather than some other way of diffusing a situation.
Thank you. If we could move on now to the position of who support Scottish and Welsh governments. Lord Fuchs.
Thanks, Chair. I was interested in your Nicholas Macpherson example, but I'm looking at it from another point of view with devolution now since 1999 in Scotland, and where we have civil servants in Scotland who are part of the UK civil service, and the Permanent Secretary, as I understand it, comes to the meetings that the Cabinet Secretary has every week, so he's involved with discussions and debates there, but he's responsible to ministers in Scotland. How does he reconcile that? To whom is he ultimately responsible? He or she ultimately responsible?
I mean, it is a very difficult thing to ride two horses. And, I mean, there are so many constitutional accommodations that we have in the way we set up the civil service that run into difficulty, I suppose, in this kind of instance. So again, if we go back to the indivisibility of the civil service from the executive government of the day, which executive government of the day are we then talking about? Is it the government at Westminster, who in the case of devolution is essentially making laws for England? So is the Permanent Secretary in Scotland or the Permanent Secretary in Wales an indivisible part of somebody else's government, as it were? That places them in a very difficult position when we consider the heat of many of the political arguments between the nations of the United Kingdom. That said, there are benefits to joined up governance across the civil service, to have the unified civil service role, and in fact, you know, part of the goal with changes such as they've made in New Zealand is to create a more unified sense of civil service, a more single unit. So there is appeal in the rest of the world towards a more unified reform, but I think we are faced with a unique situation here in the United Kingdom with the devolved nations.
Servant of two masters is the way of describing it in theatrical terms. But there are two examples at the moment. One is gender reform recognition, where the Scottish Parliament have passed an act, but it's been blocked by the UK government on the basis that it has an effect on the Equality Act, which is a United Kingdom provision. And then there's the disposal of containers, which they're trying to introduce in Scotland, which is creating huge problems because they're going to have to produce in Scotland bottles that are only sold in England or England and Wales, and huge problems. Now, this permanent secretary, how does he advise on that?
Very carefully.
Yes.
And with some difficulty. I think, those are two examples. Personally, I think over time those examples will grow to the point at which the disaggregation, if you like, from the unified civil service model, so the insisting that permanent secretary in Scotland or in Wales is a unified part of the UK civil service, I think that will shift for exactly those reasons. If you are to serve the government of the day, you need the opportunity to provide frank and fearless advice on policy questions to the government that you are serving. So we need to be clear about which government that is.
Our witnesses last week seemed to imply that it wasn't really different from differences between two Whitehall departments, which could be resolved by discussion. But it is really, isn't it? It's because especially if there are political differences between the government in Scotland and the government in the United Kingdom.
I understand the point about the Whitehall departments, and it will come as no shock to people on this committee that there are disagreements between Whitehall departments that have to be managed and navigated. But I would suggest that there is a qualitative difference between negotiating between departments both serving the same government and negotiating between one government here in Westminster and another government at Holyrood or in fact in Cardiff.
You say that's unique to the United Kingdom. What about Canada? Have there been similar problems between Quebec and the Canadian government?
Yeah, I know the Australian case better than the Canadian case in that circumstance, and every state has its own civil service or public service in the Australian parlance that serves the state government of the day.
They're separate.
They are separate to the Commonwealth Public Service, and that makes sense when you think about the degree of political rancour that often occurs between the states in Australia, and from what I understand, the provinces in Canada face exactly the same difficulties.
Thank you.
Before devolution, I think it was part of the career path of somebody appointed to, particularly the Scottish office, but I'm sure it was the same in Wales, to spend some time at Westminster, just simply to make sure that the integration of the civil service was established within the traditions within which that individual was working. So provided that has continued after devolution, as I think it is, but I may be wrong, there is a sort of an awareness built into the way in which the senior servant, as he moves or she moves up the process, operates. So to some extent one can measure up to the problem that you've identified by the way in which the civil service itself organises the the career path of the individual. Would you agree with that? I mean, otherwise, if it's entirely somebody living an entire career in Wales or in Scotland, and given the effect of devolution, it's very difficult to see how the two masters can be served. But if your career has got yourself used to the idea that there are indeed two masters, it may be easier to measure up to the task.
I mean, I certainly don't disagree with that observation. I think, in my mind, I wonder if both are possible, so that you have, for the purposes of movement within the civil service, you have unified practices that allow movement, but a recognition that whilst you are serving in Scotland, and you are serving the devolved government in Scotland, you are serving them as though they are your government of the day. And if you return to Westminster, you will serve the Westminster government as your government of the day. So I think there is just that clarity around which government you are serving, which does not then preclude open movement between services.
Yes. Geographically, there is, of course, a UK presence in Edinburgh with its own office, and the civil servant could just be moving across the street from one building to another. But obviously, it's a different atmosphere depending on which building you're in. But I wonder whether this has implications for the recruitment to the very senior position, because you can imagine that when you come to the choice of somebody to become a permanent secretary, one might think that one wouldn't be restricted to people who'd been working in Scotland. There'd be people with experience in Whitehall as well. But do you think that can survive with the present situation now? That the recruitment would always have to be somebody who was essentially a Scottish-based or a Cardiff-based civil servant?
I mean, perhaps it's stretching my conception too far. It's too sunny an Australian conceptualisation. But if we have free movement, as it were, between different arms of the civil service, then there is absolutely nothing to prevent the Scottish government saying, I'd like to bring this person up from London to fill this role. It's great to have somebody who understands the Westminster, as in the London world. But when they are here, I will then expect them, or we have set up the guidelines to expect them to serve the government of the day as being the Scottish government of the day. So I very much take the point that it is in fact undesirable to limit the career paths of senior civil servants, and it's undesirable in the sense that government will work better the wider your experience across the UK, I think. So I believe we are in agreement.
Thank you.
Fine, thank you very much. Can we move on to other actors on the stage when it comes to recruitment and dismissal of permanent secretaries? Lord Strathclyde, you had a question.
Yes, thank you very much. You've been very helpful in clarifying the role between ministers and civil servants. But what about special advisors? Do you see them being increasingly influential in the appointment, the recruitment and the dismissal of civil servants, or is that a little bit overdone by the press, the media, political opponents and so on? It would be interesting to hear your views on that. And also, whether or not the code of practice that governs the behaviour of civil servants, of special advisors, should be updated to make sure that they do not play any kind of a role.
They are such an interesting invention, are they not? The special advisor, and some of the writing about them as this sort of constitutional shadow, even in the Australian setting, that we have a clear conception of the dance, as it were, between a civil service and democratically elected executive, and into that we have now inserted this third force without necessarily understanding exactly what role they will play when they are there. In terms of the recruitment of civil servants, I see very little in the Code of Conduct for Special Advisors that says in any formal way they are and should be involved in the selection of civil servants, or they are and should advise on the selection of civil servants. So our problem, such as it is, I don't think is necessarily with the formal guidelines. Our issue, I think, is with the informal truth that if I am a serving minister and I have around me SPADs that I know and trust, would I not ask them for their view on somebody? I think that's highly unlikely. It's very natural that I would do that. And it's very natural that the SPADs would then offer that view. And depending on the power and influence of the particular special advisor, that might be a very persuasive view in the process. So my fear, I suppose, would be that if let's say we updated the Code of Conduct to say specifically special advisors should have no role in appointing civil servants, is that sufficient to close the door towards informal consultation, which I suspect will happen anyway? So to the extent that it's a solution, I'm not sure it would solve the problem as we conceiving it.
It's not a huge problem, this sort of informal consultation. And as you said, it's a very natural reaction.
I think the challenge is if that consultation, if you like, occurs in public, to go back to my theme. So if you have conversations in public led by particularly influential advisors who are saying this civil servant should go or this civil servant should not, that is different to quietly.
So would you say that there are also some interesting instances over the last 25 years when special advisors have been appointed who clearly had a very political role vis-à-vis the civil service?
Would I say there are instances?
Yeah.
Yes, I think I could. And obviously Dominic Cummings springs to mind, but we mustn't forget Alistair Campbell was also quite an influential figure in New Labour, as I recall. And there are, unfortunately, instances where SPADs less able than those two that I just mentioned also find themselves in the public limelight.
I was going to ask about the Dominic Cummings type instance. I mean, what you said about the minister seeking informal advice from special advisors to the position of senior civil servants, that's obviously inevitable and not a bad thing. Describe what you think went wrong on for example, the Dominic Cummings example.
Well, at the end of the At the end of the day, the constitutional position, such as it is, of special advisors is that they are the indivisible creature of their the government that appoints them, of the minister that appoints them. So if we have a problem with the behaviour of a special advisor, the person who needs to take responsibility of for that is the person who employs the special advisor, who needs to say it is not appropriate to publicly speculate in this way or to lead a public debate in this way. Because that is where the clear sort of chain of accountability currently sits. Who else can discipline, if you like, a special advisor other than the minister or prime minister for whom they work?
Okay.
finished your...
Yeah,
Okay. Right, we're moving on to our last question. Baroness Andrews.
Thank you very much, Professor Grube. It's a big question. I'm sure we can crack it in the remaining moments. Do you think the concept of merit, first of all, how would you describe the concept of merit in what you describe as this changed situation? Do you think it still holds? Do you think it applies in a slightly different way to senior civil servants now? And would you agree with previous evidence we've had that it's probably time for a redefinition? And if so, how would you redefine it?
Good heavens. It is a difficult question. So, in answer to the point, has the component parts of merit changed in relation to permanent secretaries? For example, there was very little call on cabinet secretaries in the 60s or 70s to be good with social media. The technological shift, the extent to which a senior civil servant now needs to be media savvy or have the capacity to deal with and understand how issues may find their way into the media and lead to disruption for the government. Those are sort of factors that I think would now be taken into account when recruiting a permanent secretary as part of a question of whether they are meritoriously deserving of the role. So there is that sort of side to it. And I mean, I agree with you that the conception of merit, going all the way back to Northcote Trevelyan, is so locked into the DNA of the civil service, and I think plays an important part. So I'm certainly not an advocate to get rid of merit, but I would be an advocate for us to have a close look at what we mean by merit in 2023 that we may not have meant by merit in the 1850s.
What you describe, I suspect, is, in terms of media knowledge and so on, is more about capability than merit. What is the balance that we should expect between knowledge and judgment in terms of what we expect the job of... We're talking about the role of the permanent secretary here. What is the job he's got to do? And what does he need to be able to do the job? Not least to withstand the sort of political pressure that we've been talking about this morning.
I mean, I very much agree that, or I would argue, that the core skill of a senior, well-functioning senior civil servant is good judgment. And good judgment assessed as a merit, in a merit-based procedure, is an incredibly difficult thing to assess, because how else do we judge it other than past activities or past actions undertaken in previous leadership positions, and whether or not that judgment is sound. Now, it's difficult to exercise sound judgment if you do not have sufficient knowledge in an area to know what sound judgment would look like. So I think we do need that balance, and need to look at that balance when we are considering what merit means in the modern civil service.
You think if we had more permanent secretaries who came from a different sort of discipline, who were more specialists, more than generalists, they would be in a better position to defend themselves against removal? For example, I mean, we've got more engineers and scientists in the civil service than we've had before. And we certainly have some of them at the top of the civil service. Do you think they're in a stronger position because of what they know or what they can call on to stand up to a minister who says, right, I don't agree, you don't share the same values and views as me?
I mean, there is a very interesting debate in the literature in Australia between a former Public Service Commissioner, Andrew Podger, and a former Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Peter Shergold, over whether frank and fearless advice is a question of contract or a question of character. And there are elements here where I suspect fighting against your removal from position as Permanent Secretary has less to do with your knowledge base at that moment than your judgment, your capacity to read the politics of the moment and to understand what the course of actions open to you are. Now, whether you have deep scientific knowledge or not, or deep engineering knowledge or not, or deep knowledge on the classics, for that decision, much more, I think, would depend on the experience that you have acquired through your years in the civil service, which comes back to why we end up with so many of our leaders in the civil service being people who have been in the civil service for some time to gain that judgment.
Thank you very much.
I'm very surprised to hear it was possible that anybody could have thought in Australia to give incomplete and frightened advice was within your contractual obligation. I'd like to comment on that. I'm very interested in this debate that was going on.
Well, the full nature of the debate is that Mr. Podger was suggesting that moving permanent secretaries or departmental secretaries onto contracts of between 3 and 5 years, if you are coming up to the moment of contractual renewal, will it not be a part of the matrix of your decision making to be aware of this moment and whether you would then pull your punches slightly in your advice?
That'd be okay.
He was suggesting it's not okay, whereas the response from Peter Shergold is to say, look, you either have the character to give frank and fearless advice or you don't. It is a part of your role as a senior public servant to do that. And that's not a question of your employment conditions, that's a question of your character and judgment.
Can I come in?
Yeah, and say people's demonstration of their character often varies according to the circumstances they're in, but yes, Lord Hope.
The word merit itself is so embedded in the whole idea of public appointments, it's difficult to get away from it, but it's the way it's defined. And the way it's defined in the recruitment principles is as follows, and I'm quoting: merit means the appointment of the best available person judged against the published criteria for the role. Now, I just wonder when we reach the level of permanent secretary, whether there are published criteria. I don't know the answer to that. Is it? I mean, further down, it's quite obvious there are, and obviously you judge the merit and find the best possible the person best equipped to fulfil the role. But by the time you reach the level of permanent secretary, the ability of the individual is not in doubt at all. And so does it really depend on a definition of the published criteria, if they're relevant at that stage at all?
I think for exactly the reasons you outline, the issue is that the criteria, in order to allow for the kind of unique skill set you're looking for, become amorphous sort of criteria. So in the Australian circumstance anyway, around, have you demonstrated leadership, and can you show your adherence to civil service values?
Yes.
All of which you would hope a permanent secretary candidate could do comfortably, and yet it doesn't necessarily get to the heart of what we want you to do as an answer to those criteria.
So it's so easy to tick all the boxes, but there is something left which goes beyond merit, really, and it's a question of judgment at a different level. And what would that be? What would the criterion be then? If it's on that, merit is satisfied fully, what next?
That is an excellent question. I'm tempted to take it as a rhetorical question because it's too difficult. But
is it personality?
Well, I think it is one of the contributing factors. And so if we go back to my sort of opening point that the governing and private system is built on people who know each other well, you have had the opportunity previously to form a view of the character of most of the people you are going to be interviewing for a position. And so you have the capacity to form a judgment about what comes next after merit based on experience and history with a particular candidate. It's very difficult, if that is absent, to replicate it in a series of criteria that say something beyond merit as something that is demonstrable on a job application, as it were.
So obviously one wants to retain merit as a criterion, but there is something else there which is probably incapable of definition. Would that be right? And it's a question of the ultimate judgment against the character and personality of the individual.
I think that is a judgment that is exercised. I agree. It still then leaves me slightly uncomfortable because it becomes then a grey area for the judgment of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet Secretary or the first Civil Service Commissioners of the day, who is to say that I have this component above merit, but candidate B does not. And yet I can think of no better alternative. So maybe I need to think more.
Thank you very much. If I could just throw in one last question, if it's outside your area of study, don't worry. But most of our discussion today has been, this era of public government and the implications for ministers, civil servants, and the relationship between the two. But of course, it does potentially impact on how Parliament and select committees engage with civil servants, which is probably a point we haven't reflected on. So instead of the kind of norms of civil servants discuss delivery, describe and explain policy, potentially being seen more by Parliament as a front line to defend government policy itself. It was just getting your view on whether that is happening, whether that carries implication, because the whole relationship is across the three. It's the ministers, civil servants and Parliament. I didn't know if you wanted to make any comment about the implications of that for the future of the role of the civil service.
I think in some ways Parliament of the three, if you like, is the most underutilised component in helping to shape or form a impartial public service. So the way select committees are currently structured, depending on the select committee, is not dissimilar, I suspect, to, let's say, Senate estimates committees in Australia, where there is essentially a feeling amongst civil servants that they are there to be got, and they are trying to not be got, as somebody I once interviewed put it as. So there, instead of a learning form of accountability, there is a drama-tinged blaming form of accountability, where civil servants, instead of helping select committees arrive at conclusions on how to govern better, are protecting perhaps themselves or perhaps their ministers from political criticism that might otherwise flow. So I wonder if there are ways we can do that better, but the issue for me is that if I'm right in my characterisation of the current governance environment as heavily contested, hyper-partisan political conversations, it doesn't leave a lot of room for civil servants appearing before committees to lift their head above the parapet and take a risk in having a more expansive conversation. There is a discussion in some other jurisdictions about whether there is an appropriate level to have that at in terms of sort of mid-term strategic thinking that civil servants can do, and without annoying the government of the day, as it were. And perhaps that is an opportunity where I could imagine more fulsome conversations between civil servants and select committees that start to take on a more of a learning and foresight nature rather than a don't say the wrong thing and end up in the newspaper sort of circumstance.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we've kept you for a long time. Thank you very much. I hope you go and relax and have a nice lunch. Taking all our questions, thank you. They've been very helpful, very informative, help our thinking, and very much appreciate you coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
We leave the public recording.
The proceeding